Hello everybody, it's I, Flamingo Writer here, back again for another Magical Girl podcast video. You know, there's a reason why I try not to spoil everything, especially when it comes to new media these days. Whether it's due to a new trend that everybody keeps talking about, new ideas about when movies are going to come out, or the fact that because new media is still being made today, which good thing it is because I appreciate art, it goes without saying that even if I did talk about something that's new, I'm probably going to be dying off of that anyways though, because that's all of what people do though. Hell, look at the recent movies that keep coming out in the 2020s era, and you can bet that movies have been evolving since then anyways though, and there's still great movies out there that I wish I could really tell you how I feel about. Hell, even something like, say, K-pop Demon Hunters, a movie that I personally love, and while I would admit that it has its fans, no shit, it doesn't seem to have fans. But honestly, what I'm trying to say is that it's easy to see that everybody who's gonna watch something fairly recently is gonna talk about it anyways, though. And that's always been enjoyable, especially even nowadays. But that's one of the reasons why I try my best to talk about magical girl shows. But don't even get me started on how many people say that the 2000s era is where magical girl shows somehow got killed off, at least for its genre. And I'm being dead serious when I say that every time I go online just to see what other magical girl shows I can add to my collection, a lot of people say that the 2000s era is when it got killed off. Now, before then, there were magical girl shows then, but I wouldn't know because, like I alluded to, I didn't really grow up with a lot of magical girl shows in the 2000s era. Hell, I didn't even grow up with a lot of shoujo, if you remember from how many times I've said that before then. But there are even times when even I'll admit, when I do say I like magical girl shows, even I'll admit there are still some shows out there I want to give off my leeway just to talk about what it is though. However, even as someone who talks about magical girl shows, myself included, I can at least interpret that, unlike a lot of people, I try not to spoil everything that goes on in magical girl show. But like I said last time, if you remember from the Corrector Yui video, I did say that last time we were gonna look at a video that happens to be an anime that, while it has an ending for the manga, the anime didn't seem to have an ending to it though. In this case, Kamichama Karin. Kamichama Karin was based on a manga by its same name, and it also had a spin-off called Kamichama Karin Chu. But instead of adapting the entire manga though, it actually had the first manga going for it though, written by Kogo Don himself though. I know nothing about the manga, but this is a good news, bad news situation when it comes to manga itself. The good news is you can actually find this manga on, say, Goodreads and thrift shops, so at least there's some places you can find it where it's relevant though, and honestly, I would recommend checking them out. But that leads to its bad news. You see, the manga itself, for whatever reason, from what I can tell though, got itself anywhere else except for the places they have though. As I alluded to again though, this is definitely a case where it never came to the West. There were plans on bringing it here though, but honestly they canceled that due to the fact that Tokyo Pop was almost defuncting itself in its own brand. It also doesn't help the fact that while I admit that I would tell you guys to use the copies that they have, yeah, I'm not so sure how many people use copies, especially when it comes to something like these here anyways though. But I am not here to talk about the manga, but sometimes I am going to refer to it in this here video. So instead I'm going to talk about it, which only lasted unfortunately, for 26 episodes. Yeah, Unfortunately, this is definitely the case where this series came out at the wrong time. Yeah, if this series would have came out years later, maybe it would have stood more of a chance, but like I said, it only lasted for one season of 26 episodes. Now granted, while that seems like enough time to at least try to do something with its own ever-enhancing story, unfortunately it didn't even go that far, at least it had though. Like I said, this lasted for two spin-offs though, and after that, however, there were no other plans to make a second season, but I'll get to that in my final thoughts though. But for better or for worse, let's talk about Kamichama Karin and see if I enjoyed it, or maybe there are some improvements along the way that we could discuss. Our story begins with our main protagonist, Karin Hanazono, our 13-year-old girl who happens to have not so much going well for her as well, it goes on, though. See, it turns out that her parents had died when she was at a young age, and furthermore, she lives with her aunt, who only has no hesitation of calling her stupid or useless because of her poor grades at school. It seems like she only has her cat, and she Chan, on the other hand, though, but unfortunately, her cat just died recently, though. The only thing she has left, however, is a ring that gives her the power to turn into a. However, one such character that comes into play is Kazume, who happens to find her wondering what she's doing at a grave right by a tree, though. But after being sexist around her, however, though, Karin hit him off by just punching him in the face, literally, and as he does, though, he just walks away, though, but she does join him as the first episode almost ends like that, though, until this guy comes to the picture, Curio, who happens to want to have the ring and get the ring away from Karin and have it all to himself. Why he does that, well, accordingly, instead of just trying to snatch it, well, he does later on, but still. And as you can probably guess, though, the entire series, well, Karin turns into the goddess by saying, "I am a god." Okay, not really like that, but I just love how Japan pronounces it, though, for the voice actress. Anyways, yeah, she turns into a goddess and she uses God of Thunder. I'm not sure if Gittatina or Maddie are watching my video right now, but I have to ask, though, what if she says, "I cast Thunder Spell"? Yeah, she says God Thunder, but I can't help but think, what if she did say that? I know this came out years before Party Crashers became a thing, though, but still, I find that hilarious. But back to the series itself, though, yeah, apparently she has yet to establish her own powers while still trying to take advantage of that, though, and why they want to have her ring as a result, while Kazume is doing everything he can to help protect her and such, even with the force of coming wrong, though. So basically what I've told you, though, is basically the premise of the series and what you're getting into the series. But honestly, besides that, though, I'm gonna have to level with you guys. When I started watching this show, this wasn't my first time watching it. I remember watching Kamichama Karin years ago in 2021 when I was watching another Magical Girl series at the time, Princess Tutu. But it's also where I watched Code Geass at the time, and while I admit that I should have gone back to this here show right away, I have to confess, though, I wonder why it took me so long to watch this show. But let's talk about the positives first before we get into the negatives of this year's show. For the positives, I will say, when it comes right down to it, even if Karin only starts living with with only Kazume and his cousin Himiko, and I swear to you, I thought from the last series of Corrector Yui was the adorable little girl, though, but screw it, I think Himiko might have the chance to have that trophy. Like, she must have dethroned or something. And maybe it's just me, but when I look at the characters here, I have to say, though, they do look like they came from the 2000s and mid to late 2000s era, though. I mean, there's no way in hell you could possibly make the series look all that. I mean, seriously, what could be? Worse than that! I think you already know why. Take the picture away! Take the picture away! I think it's getting my soul! Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Whew. Yeah. Where was I? Oh, yeah. Okay, let me just take the elephant out of the room, because honestly, if I ignored any further, we'd be here all day. So let's get the most obvious out of the way. Yes, as some people have pointed out, this here show has a weird art style. And it's not just Karin, though. Practically any character who's around 13 or younger than that has these big eyes, while the older characters have small eyes. I get that's accustomed to anime, though, but can I just say for the record, when I first saw this year anime, it kind of reminded me of Clannad or Air or Higurashi When They Cry, or if a series that I'm not so sure how many of my audience are familiar with this series, but has anyone heard of H2O, Footprints in the Sand? Seriously, it kind of reminded me of those designs, except in Kamichama Karin's defense, I think the designs work better there than they do in that this year in that series, because the series itself has these bland color washed out stuff though. Yeah, Kamichama and Karin has that too, but I think it has better designs is all I'm saying though. Plus it doesn't help my case that this was a mid to late 2000s series, so they have that though. But then again, they're both animated by different studios. H2O Footprints in the Sand was animated by Studio Zexus, and Kamichama Karin was animated by Studio Satellite. I haven't heard of Studio Satellite before now, but I thought I'd bring that up. And while I may not have watched all of H2O Footprints in the Sand, though, the closest thing I can get from that series, however, though, is that I know from The Hero of Tomorrow he did take a look at that series years ago, but we're not talking about that, though. So let's move on to something else in Kamichama Karin, though. One thing I will say about this show in its own favor is how the premise itself really got my interest. I mean, seriously, a magical girl turning into a goddess in order to stop fallen gods or anything like that along those ways when it comes to that, though. I think it actually did get me on the wrong hook, though. But am I the one who feels like every time I watch something shoujo related, they're always going to have to something god related? Seriously, this isn't the first time I've ever seen something that had something with gods in it. Fruits Basket, for example, and maybe better example, Kamichama Karin did that a little more though, but I'm just saying, no, they seem to love that a lot. As for the story itself though, while I did hear a lot of things from this series that caught my interest though, I actually love the things that they do add in here though. For example, I mentioned Kazumi earlier though, and while I admit he is a very interesting character, like at first glance, though, I thought Kazume would be this just stuck up and he is a bit sexist and stuff like that. But thankfully, he doesn't do that too much overall in the entire series, though, because he does seem to hear about Karin as time goes on. Though he kind of reminds me of Vikir's personality from Princess Tutu, where despite being a stubborn prick and everything, though, he does genuinely care for Karin as time goes on, though. And I have to fully admit, though, I kind of like what they do with his godlike powers. See, for those who don't know, though, Kazum, and they can't actually use those powers all the time, though, because since he's not used to turning into a god when protecting Karin, he actually can't use them fully well, because if he does, he'll lose consciousness, and then he'll wonder what happened, though. It's really surprising, though, and even beyond that, though, while I do like that route, what they go with it is kind of dark, though. Like, sometimes it feels like if they take too much energy away from him, he can pretty much lose consciousness, and his life could be in danger after that, though. I wish they explored it a little more, but, again, only 26 episodes. Or hell, how about someone like, say, Kimiko? And I have to say, though, I thought I would take the most adorable character out there, but in spite of the big eyes that she has, though, I will say she kind of reminds me of Tomoyo from Cardcaptor Sakura, though, where she may seem like she's all cutesy and all that, though, but she's actually pretty sweet and all that stuff. But when she gets bugs, yeah, I forgot to mention, Kazume has a huge fear of bugs, and it plays that for laughs, though. And I have to say, whenever she does get bugs, I have to say, she really seems to be much braver than that, though. I'm not a huge bug person myself, but I still find they're pretty cute, though. But her voice almost reminds me of a Japanese voice version of Fluttershy from Friendship is Magic. It's really that soft-spoken and quite cute when you listen to her voice, though. But the main villain himself, though, however, I want to talk more about him, though. Despite looking like a character I've already covered before, Kanome from Magical Girl site, though, I think this guy tops it for being a villain. Yeah, he does have his moments where he can be a bit goofy at times, though, or something like that, but once you see him wanting to catch the ring or something, you have to wonder why he wants to keep that ring all for himself. And what's more, he does act so devious when doing so already, though. Once we get right down to it, though, this seems like a good idea on paper, though. He does have a younger twin, though, who calls him Nissan, but honestly, though, if I listed all the characters here, though, we'd be here all day, though. And I have to confess, though, it's really easy to see that happening for what's worth, though, especially for what we got, though. However, if you've been following me for quite some time in this video, you may have noticed something. I've only covered about what I think about the story and about the characters, and despite the animation having its weird eye texture to it, though, you might be asking yourself, though, what do I think of it overall as the series goes on, though? Well, I'm not saying that this is a bad series, but it felt like there were some things I kind of have to tilt my head and say, this is really a Magical Girls show? parts of it do feel like a magical girl. Like, we do have a little mascot character named Shi-chan. Okay, I'm just gonna call her Shi-chan because that's what she kind of reminds me of when I look at the cat. I mean, she has a different name, but I'm not gonna confuse people what they have for the names though. So I'm just gonna say Shi-chan. Anyway, Shi-chan here, while she does look like she could be a mascot for a magical girl series, she does seem more like she's a comic relief character more than it is, though. And honestly, when it comes right down to it, though, I can't really say that much upon that besides being she's a goddess from the heavens, though, and everything. So I guess she's trying to be all like that, though. But anyway, I look at it, though, she doesn't really have that much of a role with this, like, being a comic relief or anything. Or hell, there's even more of a build-up between the romance between Karin and Kazume, which, while I admit that's nothing new for magical girl shows, I feel like they could have at least balanced that with the magical girl aspect to it in of itself. You could argue that they did this with Sakura and as well as say Sharon. Yeah, I have a hard time pronouncing the name Sakura or Sakura because everywhere I see an anime where they have that name, they always say it differently, at least in English dubs. Anyways, you can say all you want about Sakura and as well as Sharon's relationship in Cardcaptor in that series, Cardcaptor Sakura. But the difference between that series and this one is that at least with Cardcaptor Sakura's defense, at least they focus on the magical girl aspects and the mysteries, and as well as have the romance. While it was pushed aside, though, they still kept on it, though at times, though. But Kamichama Karin doesn't even do that. Like, I'm not saying that this series is anywhere bad necessarily, but it feels like every time I watch Kamichama Karin, I'm just here asking myself, when are we gonna get to the magical girl aspect? And the answer is, every few episodes. And sometimes when it comes to the finale, it did feel like they had their arc, though. Not only does the arc feel rushed at times, but it feels like the creators were thinking, hey, what if we lollygag around more and see where it gets on here, though? Like, it's more like focus on romantic comedy and magical girl second, because the magical girl aspects doesn't even come into play a lot in this. Maybe this is how it was written in the manga in its own integrity, though, but I wouldn't know because, like I said, I haven't really read it, and it's hard to do so due to the licensing issues. And even beyond that, though, it still leaves me a lot more questions than answers, though. That's kind of the problem I have with Kamichama Karin necessarily, though. While I don't really want to say this is a bad series, it feels more like the creators were more focused on lollygagging around rather than itself, though. It had a lot of mysteries to it, like, say, why do they want the ring so much, and what's more, they did have more of what time goes on, though. But sometimes it feels more like, say, the creators were just more focused on saying filler, though. Like, sometimes the episodes themselves more focus on comedy. Sometimes they focus on the romance between Karin and Kazume. And sometimes they focus more on the mysteries as time goes on. But some things never get brought up, though, until, say, maybe at the beginning of the episode. And then later on, though. And then they kind of forget about it. And they're like, oh shit, we might as well forget about this, though. And just move on to something else. But maybe that's why some people said that magical girl aspect kind of killed off in the 2000s era. But then again, I wouldn't know because of that anyways, though. Let me put it to you this way. When you look at my Magical Girl podcast, I did talk about some Magical Girl shows that came out from the early to mid-2000s era. Mermaid Melody, Sugar Sugar Rune, and yes, there were a few others along the way, but I think what really dives into those shows necessarily is that despite having a short run in time, although I really think that Mermaid Melody really wasted more time with 91 episodes. I don't know if that was part of the manga, but you take your pick though. But Kamichama Karin had the least amount of episodes from what I gather, and I can't necessarily say if that is true because I'm still watching more Magical Girl shows to add to this podcast. But one thing that does bother me is how much time it felt wasted when you get right down to it, though. More filler and less about the story means that you're just wasting it anyways, though. And I really feel pretty bad about that in a lot of... It's as if the creators were thinking, hey, why don't we just build up the story and basically just go from there and not do anything with it, but we can still have its own predecessor, though. I wouldn't say I don't like Kamichama Karin, I do like it, but I don't think I like it as much as some people have, though. Even to people who have read the manga, from what I gather, though, I did hear it's a lot better in terms of story, and what's more, there were plans to make a second season out of this, and, okay, this is going to count as a spoiler alert, but Honestly, I don't know if you ever want to be spoiled for the series, but if you can't find the manga elsewhere, you're gonna have to be warm about to tell you though. So let's move on. So it turns out that yeah, apparently this here ending, while it didn't seem like it took like a 3 or 4 parter to get things going in the final episodes, the series itself just feels more like say it was ending anticlimactically. Yeah, it turns out that the ending itself was more like say, hey, we've had our fun, but now it's time to close the book and we'll be back for a second season. I shit you not. When I was watching the last episode by the time of making this here context of what makes for this year video, I'm just gonna say out right at the bat, they did say there were plans for a second season, but unfortunately it never really went with that second season. Kamichama Chu, for those who don't know, was not only a spin-off, but it felt more like a time skip, if anything, to show the relationship between Karin and Sume as time goes on, though. Yet for some reason we never really gotten that far as time goes on, though. Yeah, as you can probably imagine, I'm not really in depth with this year's series, but I know one person who can go more in depth than I could ever have, though. There's this user by the name of Sailor Guardian Hope, and while I don't really watch a lot of her videos though, she actually does go more in depth about Kamichama and Karin than I could ever hope to have though. I'll leave a link in the description below, but the gist of it is that she actually does talk about more about the anime than I could ever have though. Other than that though, I don't really think there's ever been a way of saying that Kamichama Karin doesn't seem to get as much recognition as it deserves. And that's pretty sad, all things considered though. But that in of itself is actually pretty sad, though. Even if I will say Kamichama Karin is a flawed series, that's nowhere near, say, a bad series. I will say I would take this series over, say, Magical Girl Site any day of the week, though, especially when it comes to the story content. It does have a lot more mystery, and they do answer some questions, but once you're starting watching the show for yourself, like I said, it doesn't really have a second season. Yeah, as I alluded to before, this show came out years later. Maybe it would have stood more of a chance. But I can't say that it was my favorite Magical Girl show. And that was in terms of how the internet praised this show, but still have one thing I cannot stand what the internet does. Spoiling everything. Like I said in the beginning, but I wouldn't say that this is the saddest anime out there. Yeah, they do follow under the tropes you see in some Magical Girl shows. Guilt trip and some lines of depression and stuff like that, especially when it comes to the mysteries behind it. But I'm gonna be as blunt as I can, though. This is nowhere near the worst like Magical Girl Site or anything else. But when it ends on something like, say, hey, that they're gonna do a second season, it kind of reminds me of Panty and Stocking. I mean, say what you want about how goddamn long Panty and Stocking took to come out with its second season, but at least we actually got a second season to it, even if it took how many years? Over a decade long? Jesus Christ. I think that's what makes me feel like I'm getting old every time. Then again, I probably wouldn't have that much going. But you know, the more I look into this year's show, the more I start asking myself, though, maybe that's why Kamichama Karin will probably never get anywhere near a second season. At least when it comes to something like that. The original manga lasted for her 7 volumes, and this spin-off lasted for the same amount. That's 14 volumes in total, and when you do the math, that's still nowhere near enough to get to us to anywhere, especially for that, though. Would it be out nowadays, though? I don't know. I mean, seriously, though, when it comes to anime these days, a lot of people seem to think that, hey, we might as well make something for boys, and that's about it. Yeah, there are some other shoujo that have been coming out in recent years. My Happy Marriage, from what I've heard is a pretty good series, and I have still yet to watch that series. But what I'm saying is that Kamichama Karin is not a bad show. It's definitely flawed, don't get me wrong, but it's definitely not the worst of anyways, though. But I'm not so sure what else to say, what I haven't already been saying. I would go over some twists in here and there and such, though, but if I did that, I probably would spoil something, though. I'm not so sure how many people watch my Magical Girl podcast if they want to see more of these here Magical Girl shows. I know my friend Miss Shia watches the Magical Girl shows like I do, but my other friends, I'm not so sure what they do, so I can't really tell them what they say. Like I said a million times over, and I'll say it again, I'm not your narrator. You do whatever is best for you, though. But with that said, I think that about wraps it up when it comes right down to it, though. Still, if you ever want to find Kamichama Karin for yourself, the only way you could find this series is by going through piracy websites. I'm sorry if that's the only way to do it, but that's all I had to say, though. So, we have a flawed series that could have been better, though. However, next time we're going to look at maybe another Magical Girl show that, while it's another classic series, though, it's too bad that a lot of people say it's a Sailor Moon ripoff, despite that many Magical Girl shows are somewhat like that, though. But before we log off, though, there is something else I need to tell you. Just because I personally didn't enjoy Kamichama and Karin as much has to do with myself personally. And I'm not saying that Kamichama is a bad series, though. I would watch it if I'm bored or something, but after that, however, I'm probably gonna say that this is definitely the category that falls into not below average, but above average enough to at least keep it coming, though. And seriously, I would have enjoyed Kamichama Karin a lot more if it wasn't for how many fans kept spoiling everything for me. This is what I mean when I say this is probably one of the reasons why I would have had, though. But you're probably asking yourself the big question, why didn't it seem like it lasted that long? In theory, I think it has to do with the timing, but I think it also has to do with something else that came along the way. Like I said before, this here series did look like it was come at the wrong time, but honestly, it came at the wrong time you wouldn't expect, though. And with that, I feel pretty bad we'll probably never get a continuation of Kamichama Karin. If we do, I really would watch it and see if they improved on it. But other than that, that's all there is, though. What do you guys think about the series? Yeah, I'm gonna say something different for my outro, so if you guys please like, comment, and Karin, please let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and hopefully the next Magical Girls show we'll cover in the podcast be a lot better than this. But until then, thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all next time, and as always, stay flamingo-tastic.